Thank you, Leandro, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in this first session of the Indiana Leeds Summer Tax Workshop Series. For those of you who don't know me yet, my name is Leopoldo Parada. I'm a lecturer in tax law at the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom. And I will be co-hosting this series with Leandra from now until August 13 that we have scheduled. So let me also just briefly take a few seconds to thank, first of all, the more than 45 terrific applications that we received. Actually, it's because of that that we were able to build up this fantastic lineup of speakers and topics for the series. And also to thank all the participants that they have shown a high interest. We have received, I don't know how many emails every day, Leandra, but so I would say keep doing that. We want to make this series as open and approachable for everyone, especially in these troubling times around the world. So having said that, Leandra?
Yeah, thank you so much, Leopoldo. And we don't want to take a lot of time with introductions, but for those who don't know me, I'm Leandra Lederman. I'm the William W. Oliver Professor of Tax Law at Indiana University Maurer School of Law in Bloomington, Indiana. And I wanted to echo Leopoldo's thanks to everyone who submitted papers and to all of you for attending today. And we're thrilled that Professor Ruth Mason from the University of Virginia will be starting us off. So I'm going to turn it back over now to Leopoldo to introduce her.
Thank you, Leandra. So, well, let me introduce Ruth Mason for those of you who don't know Ruth yet. Ruth Mason is she's an Edwin Coyne Distinguished Professor of Law and Taxation at the University of Virginia School of Law in the United States, where she also teaches taxation, comparative tax law, and international tax law. Her research focuses mainly on tax discrimination in the United States and also in the European Union, with recent articles referred to the compatibility of digital services taxes and European Union law, co-authored with another great writer. She's an editor of the series of in international taxation at Clover Law International. She's also a member of the editorial board of the World Tax Journal, and he's a worldwide recognized scholar. Her work has been cited by the US Supreme Court, and she's also a very good friend. So I'm pretty happy that Ruth is actually kicking off the series. Let me just speak briefly about Ruth's paper today, titled The Transformation of International Tax. This terrific article, I have to say, provides a very positive evaluation of the OECD base erosion and profit shifting project. Basically, arguing that BEPS, unlike all the technical criticism that can have, has served as an engine to expand the international tax agenda, bringing countries together in apparent equal footing to achieve global consensus on tax matters. I have to say also that it's pretty interesting in Ruth's article, what she argues about BEPS in terms of that BEPS reflects and effectuates what she denominates full taxation, a sort of new modern downside departure of single taxation, and which is represented also in what she denominates fiscal fail-safe rules. That is, provisions that if one country does not impose taxation, another country automatically pulls the trigger and does it. So without any further introduction, I want to leave the floor to Ruth. We are really looking forward to hear your presentation today.
Well, I'm really glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation. And I'm wearing my blue and orange to honor the just graduated class of 2020 from UVA Law. So if there are any new alums here, congratulations. Okay. So I wanted to start with a joke, but since I don't have a sense of humor, I have to steal one from my son. So he said, you know, so that some of you have seen this tweet, my son schedules time with each stuffed animal so they aren't lonely. I told him he could put one in my office with me today. This is apparently the only one that enjoys tax law. When I posted this, it got lots of likes and retweets. And when I told my son that his tweet was the most popular thing I'd ever posted on Twitter, his logical response was, Mama, you should stop tweeting about tax and just tweet jokes. Imagine if we all did it, we might be having more fun. The rest of this presentation will contain 0 jokes. Okay, so the thesis of this paper is essentially BEPS was not a nothing burger. I can be more specific, okay? BEPS changed the participants' agenda, institutions, and norms, and the legal instruments of international tax. Okay, so the paper starts out with sort of the well-worn history of corporate tax avoidance. There's nothing new here, right? So what are the basics of the international tax system? Nobody on this call needs any help with that. What are some factors that intensify corporate tax avoidance? Well, legal fragmentation, by which I mean the division of the tax system up into national tax systems, which therefore creates gaps. Economic liberalization, the obsolescence of the tax treaty permanent establishment requirement. Unilateral measures were insufficient. States, in some cases, undermine their own anti-abuse rules. There's a famous case of the US essentially poking holes in its own CFC regime through check the box. Enforcement of the arm's length standard was spotty, and the standard itself is highly malleable. Barriers to cooperation are many and varied. States were competing over not only real factors, but mere paper profits. They had interests that differed from each other. There were monitoring problems and a general reluctance to cede national tax sovereignty. And then there were just open questions about what the best way to proceed was, and even whether there ought to be procession. That is there even a problem here that needs to be dealt with? David Rosenblum's views on this are well known. Okay, so what changed? A number of things. So the most obvious was the 2008 financial crisis. This put a lot of pressure on budgets. Budgets across Europe were in austerity. At the same time, the US Senate and the UK Parliament held hearings on corporate tax avoidance that revealed previously unknown only to, or previously known only to specialists, complex tax avoidance measures that, let's say, didn't play well on the front page of the New York Times, which is where they later appeared. This led to, at least in the UK, actual tax protests, people in the street protesting Starbucks for failure to pay British tax. This was followed, or in some cases simultaneous, with other leaks. These leaks involving both individual tax evasion, but then also leaks like LuxLeaks that suggested not only that corporations were actively trying to avoid their tax, which was well known, but also that states seemed to be colluding with multinationals to help them avoid other states' tax. So Manal Corwin, who's a former US Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Tax Affairs, called this the mainstreaming of international tax. Like, once a topic, however technical, however obscure, goes mainstream, then politicians start paying attention, and that's when things change. Okay, so at the same time that you had this political attention being paid to corporate tax avoidance, there were certain institutional changes that had occurred that made the conditions more receptive for major changes. one of which was that the G20, after the financial crisis, became a meeting of political leaders rather than a meeting of finance ministers and central bankers alone. There was a growth in power in the EU relative to the member states. That's my take. The reason why this is important is because the EU then becomes an actor itself in BEPS, and it also provides a way for the EU member states to implement the BEPS action items. So the EU as an institution or as a form of government allows the member states to trade off amongst themselves on issues maybe that are unrelated to tax in order to get agreement on the tax matters. And that's important for reaching agreement. And then of course I have here Commission as a wild card or monkey wrench, right? Like at any minute the Commission could do anything. It could pass a digital tax, or it could, start investigating companies start investing countries that having given state aid under novel theories. Now, how do we prevent this? Well, maybe one way is to agree about what the ground rules are, and then we can keep the Commission out of our hair. Okay, and then also the experience of the OECD and G20 members with the success of the transparency measures, CRS, for example, suggested that the OECD could be successful at the next project. Okay, so the OECD and G20 states charged the OECD with reforming international tax to curb corporate tax avoidance. Okay, so what are the changes? And I go through a variety of changes. Other people might see other things that are important. Some people might think that some of these things aren't as important as I say they are, but let me give you the case. So first, participants, the most important thing that happens here is that the G20 joins the OECD on an equal footing to make the international tax policy. And then to a lesser extent, we have the inclusive framework, which I think also matters, but that the main show here is that the addition of the G20. This is a really important development. It brings in China and India, countries with very large populations whose perspective was sorely missing in the OECD, into the negotiation and the policymaking process. Additionally, mediating BEPS through the OECD gave other stakeholders an opportunity to participate in those public discussion fora. So for example, the BEPS monitoring group springs up in response to BEPS and writes reports and so on to try and sort of hold the countries to the promise, the promises inherent in BEPS. I should say the promise inherent in BEPS, no actual promises. Okay, so also there's a new role, I think, for multilateralism and for the OECD that flows out of BEPS. Now we start getting recommendations, not just for tax treaties, not just for commentary and guidelines, but recommendations for domestic law. That is new. It becomes clear that the OECD is the forum for international tax policy making. Alison Christians has written that this was one of the points of BEPS, right? That the OECD wanted to solidify its control as the forum for international tax policy making. Maybe the best evidence for this is, that BEPS 2.0 is being negotiated at the OECD, and moreover, that the OECD Secretariat put out under its own name, not as it usually does on the behalf of its members, but under its own name, the unified approach to the allocation question. Now, the Secretariat putting this out under its own name, you could take that as just a proxy for how controversial the proposal is, and no one state wants to say that's my idea, or none of them, and they don't collectively want to commit to that either. But it is significant that now the Secretariat is putting out under its own name major initiatives. Okay, and then there's acceptance of full tax as a norm. So this is a descriptive claim, right? That the states the actions that they take in BEPS reflect their growing acceptance of full tax as a norm. Full tax as a norm doesn't start with BEPS, it won't end with BEPS, but BEPS reflects it and to some extent it effectuates it. So full tax is just the idea that a corporation's income should be subject, all of it, to tax where its productive factors are. It's equivalent to other terms with which we're very familiar, all of them really awkward, right? Prevention of profit shifting, prevention of double non-taxation, and so on. So together with a no double tax norm, we can understand full tax as two parts of Aviona's single tax principle. If you get them both, then you have single tax. You don't have double tax, you don't have no tax, you have single tax. Okay, so the main difference is that Reuven's conception has a distributive rule, but full tax and no double tax don't have a distributive rule. That's a problem, and we'll come to it. Okay, so how do we know, what's the evidence that full tax is being adopted here as a new norm? It's in the standards, right? So the transparency measures, country by country reporting, rulings exchange rely on this idea that a company's income should be fully subject to tax. Anti-abuse rules in the tax treaties, standards for harmful tax practices that require substance. So these are minimum standards that tend to go towards or to effectuate, support full tax. But also non-minimum standards, many of them do the same thing, get at the same result. Fiscal fail-safes, including anti-hybrid rules, CFC best practices, and so on. Okay, so what do I mean by fiscal fail-safes? You know, I arrived at this term, I was talking about how, you know, it seems like these BEPS countries, what they really want is mutually assured taxation. But that's not quite right either. So I started looking up engineering terms like robustness, and that's how I came to fail-safes. So, you know, fail-safe is, it's typically a mechanical safety measure you put in place in case your main mechanical device fails. So the elevator doesn't plunge if something goes wrong. Instead, the secondary brake engages. Okay, so you have a backup system in case the first system fails. That's a fail-safe. The tax variety works the same way. So if the primary rule doesn't work, there's some kind of secondary rule that gets triggered to ensure the results you want, which in this case is full tax. Okay, so the tax treatment in one state then has to be linked to the tax treatment in the other. There's a trigger. You specify the conditions that trigger tax in the second state. They specify the special tax treatment, and what matters here is that that special tax treatment is special. It's a deviation from the state's normal rules. And then the overall goal is normative to arrive at full tax or anti-abuse. So just as an example, how do anti-hybrid rules work as a fiscal fail-safe? Well, there's the link, right? So the tax in the receiving state of a payment on capital is linked to how that payment was taxed in the paying state. So the trigger here is, did the paying state allow a deduction? If so, then the receiving state will deny the exclusion even if under domestic law the receiving state sees equity, and equity ordinarily would be exempt. And then the goal is to ensure single tax, full tax, I should say, of the hybrid, right? So single tax is an idea with a distributive rule. Full tax is just an idea of you got to tax everything. We're not really sure how to define everything. We have a sense of it, but everything. Okay. Fiscal fail-safe. So this is not a new idea. I mean, it's a new name, but it's not a new idea. These already exist all over the place, right? So it's kind of like the sixth sense, you know. Now you see dead people, you're going to see fiscal fail-safes everywhere. Worldwide tax is a fiscal fail-safe. CFC regimes are fiscal fail-safes. Those are unilateral. What changes in BEPS is that now that they're coordinated, more widespread, which the idea is that will make them more effective. Okay, it also helps defeat defection. I have this example in the paper that tries to give two reasons why different sets of states have different reactions or different the different genesis in different states of the debt equity hybrid problem. So in high tax states, the problem is that states don't want to cede their view of what constitutes debt and equity. It's not that they want to help companies avoid tax, it's that their definitions of debt and equity are dominated by domestic concerns that swamp the problem of creating a loophole on the international side. They can't agree. But there's another set of states for whom disagreement is the point. They're trying to, in Omri Marian's terms, manufacture gaps for taxpayers, and these two sets of states are not going to easily be able to agree on the same definition of debt and equity. So the fail-safe allows the first set of states to adopt rules that cut out the second set of states. They split the income, the revenue between them that previously was going to the second set of states. Okay. So the way fiscal fail-safes work, it's not limited to defeating defection by havens. It also works against the United States. And there's an example in the paper about how US resistance to country-by-country reporting was handled through what could be called an administrative fail-safe. You can look at that in the paper. Okay, so what else is new about BEPS? I mean, some of these things are new. Well, the MLI is truly new, right? Some of these things are just more expansive use of techniques or methods that already existed in international law or even in international tax. So you have what I call coordinated unilateralism, which is just the same as soft law, but that term in international relations freaks people out. So we'll just say unilateral, coordinated unilateralism, interest deductibility, anti-hybrid rules, CFC rules, right? So that the standards are negotiated multilaterally, but then they're implemented domestically. So this allows countries to cooperate by minimizing delegation to multilateral bodies. The control stays at the domestic level, at least nominally. And the idea here again is that coordinated anti-abuse rules can be more effective than unilateral anti-abuse rules, and it caters to states' resistance to ceding authority to multinational institutions. The other nice thing about coordinated unilateralism is that it leverages network effects, so that if there are countries on the margin and they're not sure whether the benefits are going to exceed the costs of joining, they can wait. And as a network effect produces more benefits, for example, more people join on to arbitration, more people or more countries get involved in country by country, the gains from that item grow and make it more worthwhile for the states on the margin to join. Okay, and then peer review, again, this is not a new idea, but we do have more extensive use of peer review following BEPS than we had previously. Okay, so the problem with BEPS is that it doesn't squarely confront this allocation issue. The BEPS countries did what they set out to do, which was to reduce corporate tax avoidance without reconsidering allocation. That's what they promised that they would do in the BEPS action plan, and that's what they did. The problem is that this turns out to be really difficult politically, so it is hard to talk through all these international tax issues while sweeping under the rug the question of who gets what, and whether the current paradigm, which was just further enforced with BEPS, like in the anti-hybrid rules, either the paying state gets the tax or the receiving state gets the tax, but there's never any question about whether the paying state is the right state to tax or the receiving state is the right state to tax. Okay, so states are not just upset that corporations dodge taxes, they're also upset with the revenue split, with the obsolescence of the permanent establishment requirement. They don't like the share of the global revenues that they're getting. And then BEPS provides a forum for airing these grievances, and it suggests the OECD is a potential locus for resolving them. So maybe one of the most important things that BEPS 1.0 does is lead into BEPS 2.0. Okay, so stepping back, individually, the BEPS deliverables might not look like very much, right? Although I think some of them are pretty impressive all by themselves, like country by country reporting. But all together, cumulatively, the impacts of BEPS are significant, including that it tees up BEPS 2.0. Okay, so what's the way to evaluate BEPS revenue? It's too early to tell, but since all of these measures are meant to raise revenue, presumably they will. Inclusivity, we have the G20 working with the OECD countries. This is very significant, and in my view, unlikely to go back. Accountability. Accountability, anytime you're using an international organization to do something that used to be done domestically, you lose democratic accountability. That's just how international law works. That doesn't mean that there are no accountability checks inside the OECD, but more done internationally means less democratic checks. That's a necessary part of this. It's particularly problematic in the EU. I mean, they've completely cut the voters out of these measures in the EU because EU legislation does not have any kind of meaningful democratic participation. The council decides, and the council is the finance minister of each state. Okay, so then there's a separate issue about accountability, which is it's hard to know what's going on inside the OECD. Okay, so overall, more international activity or more international standards tend to constrain policy outcomes. They entrench policies even once it becomes obvious that those policies don't work anymore, like the PE requirement, perhaps like the arm's length standard, because everyone has them and there are all these deep investments in them, they're hard to move away from. And so here I have all of these like cool new terms, a Luxembourg effect, which is Lily Fahlhaber's term for describing how the strictures of EU law bind not only the EU states, but other states. Paris effect is the same thing for for OECD standards on non-OECD states. And then what I've referred to as the OECD AUKUS, which is just this idea that in order to be part of this group of countries that gets to come together in the inclusive framework of the OECD, you have to undertake certain obligations. You have to sign up for the BEPS minimum standards. Then we have the problem of the indeterminacy of full tax. So the full taxation is indeterminate in exactly the same way that double tax is. Both of these terms are kind of mushy and conceptually unsatisfying because we don't know whose tax system we're talking about. We don't have a clear reference base that tells us what the tax base is and what the tax rates are. So this idea of full tax doesn't specify where income should be taxed and why. It has no distributive rule. What that means is that you can get double tax from a norm of full tax in exactly the same way you can get double non-tax from a norm of no double tax. That is, full tax leads to tax by more than one state. If we don't know which state ought to be taxing and there's a tax vacuum, more than one state may claim the authority, the entitlement to tax that gap. Likewise, no double tax may lead more than one state to recede. That's how we get a double non-tax result. Okay, so we see this concern expressed by the United States about country by country reporting. What happens when countries have these reports? Are they just going to assess tax according to where the factors lie, will we get double tax results then? In the EU, you see it in the state aid tax rulings debacle, right? The result of the Apple case is that Ireland gets to tax Apple's income. Like, how does that make sense? I mean, it does get you the full tax result that satisfies the full tax norm, but as a distributive matter, it doesn't seem to make sense. It doesn't seem to accord with tax where the value is. Okay, so what do we need to fix it? We need clear distributive rules. That's BEPS, this should say 2.0, okay, which only takes on part of the problem, but that's what we really need here. That's the horse, right? So, you know, BEPS 1.0 is the cart, we miss the horse here. Okay, so how will countries resolve this distributive dispute? Theory goes in multiple directions. So arguments about efficiency are indeterminate or they're conflicting. We lack shared norms about distributive justice. This has always been true, and yet in the past we've managed to work it out through bargaining at the state level. So in my view, national self-interest is going to be decisive, not exclusive, but decisive in BEPS 2.0, which leads to the question, what do states want? Well, the US wants everything to stay the same. They're the winner of the old paradigm. So everybody else wants change, wants to get a bigger slice of the pie. This is a zero-sum negotiation, or nearly so. Their surplus may arise from legal certainty, and eliminating unilateral measures may reduce double tax. That's actually a good thing because it means that multinationals can get on board to support compromise. Okay, so then there's this point of the US and the EU, or European countries, as tax frenemies. So, you know, for decades, US law pretty obviously facilitated foreign tax dodging. This benefited not only the competitiveness of US companies, but also the US fisc. But the rise of digital companies seemed to make it worse. Okay, so now Western European countries feel the sting of being source states vis-a-vis the United States. And then this has triggered a bunch of unilateral actions, not only in Europe, but elsewhere. So state aid, diverted profits, tax, digital taxes, all of these responses just reflect dissatisfaction with the revenue split as we see it in tax treaties today. So the hope for BEPS 2.0 is that the need to avoid unilateralism and double tax can be enough to motivate cooperation. Let's see. That, I believe, is 20 minutes.